The night had settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that wrapped around me in the comfort of routine. The hum of the city outside my window was distant, softened by the gentle whir of the ceiling fan. I had drifted into sleep, my body finally surrendering to the exhaustion of the day. But then, something sharp, something wrong. Pain shot through my chest, sudden and unrelenting, dragging me from sleep like a cruel hand yanking me into wakefulness. I gasped, my breath catching as if the very air had turned against me. The pressure was unbearable, crushing down with an invisible force that stole my ability to think. My fingers fumbled in the darkness, searching for something, anything, to anchor myself. The nightstand. I grasped at it, but the smooth wood provided no relief. The room tilted, blurred, the shadows bending in unfamiliar ways. My lungs refused to expand, and panic tightened its grip, a vice closing around my ribs. Then a sound, footsteps, urgent and steady. Ethan. The door burst open, light spilling in from the hallway, casting his figure in sharp relief. His face, always so composed, tightened with concern. But he didn't panic. He never did. Without hesitation, he crossed the room in 3 quick strides, his strong hands finding me, steadying me. The moment his arm wrapped around my shoulders, pulling me upright, I felt the first flicker of relief. His warmth seeped into me, a silent reassurance that I wasn't alone in this. "Breathe, Maddie." His voice was steady, but underneath, I heard the thread of tension he couldn't quite hide. "I got you." I wanted to tell him I was trying, that I was doing everything I could to force my lungs to obey, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I focused on him, on the solid weight of his arm around me, on the way his thumb brushed lightly against my shoulder in an absent, comforting motion. Time blurred after that. One moment, I was clinging to him, the next, I was being guided through the cool night air, Ethan's grip firm as he helped me into the passenger seat of the car. Then we were moving. The city stretched past in streaks of gold and blue, the glow of streetlights flashing against the windshield in rhythmic bursts. My vision wavered, exhaustion creeping in, but I kept my eyes on Ethan. His jaw was clenched tight, his hands gripping the wheel with a force that turned his knuckles white. He was afraid. I hated that. Even in my haze, I lifted a trembling hand, resting it lightly on his forearm. A silent message. "I'm here. I'm okay." He didn't say anything, just flipped his gaze toward me for the briefest moment before returning to the road. But his grip on the wheel loosened just slightly, and I knew he'd understood. The hospital loomed ahead, sterile and cold against the night sky. Ethan pulled into the emergency lane, and before I could even try to move, he was already at my side, opening my door, his arms around me again. The weight of the night pressed in, the uncertainty, the fear. But Ethan was here, and somehow, that made all the difference. The hospital air was sharp, thick with the clinical sterility of antiseptic and the faint, metallic tang of something I couldn't quite name. I had always hated hospitals. The quiet here wasn't comforting, it was hollow, edged with the hum of machines and the distant murmurs of hushed conversations. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, washing everything in an artificial, almost sickly glow. I lay still, too exhausted to move, the thin hospital gown cool against my skin. My breathing had steadied, though each inhale still felt foreign, as if I had to remind my lungs how to do something they had always known. The oxygen mask clung to my face, pressing lightly into my cheeks, its rhythmic hiss the only sound I could focus on besides the soft, persistent beeping of the heart monitor. I let my gaze drift to the 4 line in my arm, the slow drip of fluid merging seamlessly into my veins, replenishing what had been lost. But none of it, the machines, the wires, the cold, felt as real as Ethan's presence beside me. He sat in the chair closest to my bed, elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped so tightly together I could see the tension in them, the way his fingers flexed slightly as if he were holding on to something he couldn't quite name. His head was bowed, his dark hair falling forward, obscuring his face. He hadn't spoken in a while, hadn't moved much either. Just sat there, rigid and unmoving, like the weight of the night was still pressing into his chest. I knew that weight well. I swallowed, my throat dry and aching. Moving my fingers felt like dragging them through thick water, but I managed. Slowly, I reached for his hand, my fingertips brushing against his skin. The smallest touch, but it was enough. His head snapped up instantly, eyes sharp and alert like I had just pulled him from deep water. The second our gazes met, something in him shifted, his expression softening, unraveling in a way that made my heart ache. God, his eyes. Ethan always had this way of looking at me, like I was the one unmovable thing in his life, the one constant in a world that never stopped shifting beneath his feet. But now they held something raw, something unguarded. It wasn't just worry. It was guilt. I hated that. I forced my fingers to curl around his hand, weak but firm enough that he would feel it, that he would know I was still here. "It's not your fault," I murmured, the words barely above a whisper, but I knew he heard them. Ethan exhaled sharply, but he didn't look away. He never did. Maybe if I'd noticed earlier, his voice was rough, thick with something heavier than regret. I wanted to tell him to stop, that there was nothing he could have done, that I had ignored the warning signs myself, convinced that pushing through the exhaustion, the stress, the weight of life, was just something I had to do. But I didn't have the strength to fight him on this, not tonight. Instead, I let my thumb brush over the back of his hand, a slow and deliberate motion, something silent and steady. A reminder. Ethan had taken care of me more than anyone ever should. And now, he was carrying the guilt of something that was never his to bear. His free hand came up, fingers brushing against my wrist before settling there, his grip firm but careful. He wasn't just holding me. He was grounding himself in me. A nurse entered, moving swiftly as she checked the monitors, adjusting the oxygen levels, making quiet notations on her clipboard. Ethan didn't move, didn't acknowledge her, his focus locked onto me as if I might slip away the second he let go. "Your vitals are stabilizing," the nurse murmured, her voice kind but distant, professional. "That's a good sign." Ethan nodded, but his grip on me didn't loosen. When she left, the silence stretched between us, heavy and thick. I didn't know how to tell him that I had been scared, too. That when the pain hit, when I couldn't catch my breath, when the world blurred at the edges, I had thought, this is it. I had thought about him, not about the things I had left unfinished, not about my job or the responsibilities waiting for me. Just him, because when everything felt like it was slipping, he was the only thing that still felt real. The exhaustion pulled at me again, dragging me under, but I wasn't afraid of it this time. Not with Ethan here, not with his warmth grounding me, his touch steady against my skin. As my eyes flutter-closed, I felt the softest press of warmth against my forehead, a whisper of a kiss. It wasn't something he did often, but in that moment, it was everything. I sighed, letting go. I was still here. I was still his, and somehow that was enough. The beeping of machines had become a steady backdrop, a rhythmic lull that wove in and out of my consciousness. I drifted in and out of sleep, caught somewhere between exhaustion and awareness, between the distant hum of hospital life and the quiet weight of Ethan's presence beside me. When I woke fully, the room was dimmer, the overhead lights softened. A faint glow filtered in through the blinds, painting pale streaks across the sterile white sheets. The air was cool, carrying the faintest hint of antiseptic and something warmer, coffee. Ethan. He hadn't left. I turned my head slightly, my body sluggish, still heavy with exhaustion. There he was, sitting in the same chair, looking just as tense as before. The only difference was the cup of hospital coffee in his hands, fingers curled around it like it was the only thing tethering him to the present. He looked tired, more than tired, worn. The kind of exhaustion that settled deep into the bones, something restless and aching. His shirt was rumpled, sleeves pushed up to his elbows, as if he had rolled them there in frustration hours ago and never bothered to fix them. His jaw was covered in the faintest hint of stubble, like the weight of the last few hours had aged him just enough to show. I wanted to reach for him, to smooth away the worry etched into his forehead, but my body refused to cooperate. Instead, I settled for watching him, the quiet rise and fall of his chest, the tension in his shoulders as he stared at nothing. Then, the door swung open. The doctor entered with the same clipped efficiency I had come to expect from hospital staff. He was tall, middle-aged, his lab coat crisp, his demeanor professional but not unkind. He held a clipboard, flipping through my chart as he stepped toward the foot of my bed. Ethan sat up straighter, the shift almost imperceptible, but I felt it. He was bracing himself, "How are you feeling, miss?" the doctor asked, his tone neutral but observant. I tried to clear my throat, my voice coming out softer than I intended. "Tired." The doctor nodded as if that was the answer he had expected. "That's normal. Your oxygen levels are back within range, but the episode you experienced wasn't just a fluke. It was your body giving you a warning." He flipped another page, then looked up. "Your condition is manageable, but if you keep pushing yourself the way you have been, it won't stay that way." I swallowed hard. I had known that, had felt it creeping up for months, the fatigue, the breathlessness, the way stress clung to me like a second skin. But hearing it aloud made it real. Ethan was silent beside me, but I didn't have to look at him to feel his tension. It radiated from him, curling around the room like an unspoken demand for answers. The doctor continued, flipping his pen between his fingers. "Your body needs a serious change in lifestyle. Less stress, a better environment." He glanced at me, then at Ethan. "Do you live in the city?" Ethan answered before I could. "Chicago." The doctor hummed knowingly, jotting something down on his clipboard. "Urban living doesn't help. The pollution, the pace, it's a perfect storm for someone in your condition." He hesitated, then smirked slightly. "Ever considered moving? Somewhere warm? Less stressful? California, maybe Costa Rica?" I let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I have a job. Responsibilities." The doctor shrugged, unconcerned. "So did a lot of my patients before they ended up here a second time. And a third." He exhaled, tapping his pen against his clipboard before slipping it into the pocket of his lab coat. "You don't have to make a decision now. But if you want to get better, you need to take this seriously." With that, he gave me a polite nod and turned toward the door, his presence leaving a weight behind that hadn't been there before. The silence stretched between Ethan and me after he left, thick with unspoken thoughts. I exhaled, staring up at the ceiling, the words sinking into my chest like stones. Move. The idea was ridiculous. My entire life was in Chicago. My job, my apartment, everything I had built. I couldn't just walk away. But then there was Ethan. I finally turned my head toward him, and what I saw made my breath catch. He wasn't just thinking about it. He was considering it. His brows were furrowed, his fingers tapping lightly against his coffee cup, his jaw set in that way it always did when he was weighing something heavy. "Ethan!" My voice was soft, but it broke the silence. His eyes met mine, searching, uncertain. I knew that look. His mind was already moving ahead, already mapping out possibilities, already trying to find a way to fix this. I wanted to tell him not to, that I wasn't his problem to solve, that I wasn't going anywhere. But the truth was, I wasn't so sure anymore. The morning of the flight, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took my time getting ready. No rushing through the motions, no quick ponytail and hurried exit. Just slow, deliberate movements. I stood in front of the mirror longer than necessary, tracing the faint lines of exhaustion beneath my eyes, the evidence of years spent pushing, carrying, enduring. It felt strange to linger, to allow myself the indulgence of care. I reached for a dress buried in the back of my closet, something soft and flowing, something I had once loved but had stopped wearing because it never felt practical. The fabric settled against my skin like a whisper of another life, a version of myself I had long since abandoned. A little makeup, a spritz of perfume I hadn't touched in months, and suddenly, I felt like someone I barely recognized. When I stepped out of my room, suitcase in hand, Ethan was waiting by the door. His eyes lifted from his phone, and for the first time in days, something unreadable flickered across his face, surprise, maybe, or something deeper, something that made his gaze linger. His eyebrow arched slightly, a small, appreciative smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Wow!" I rolled my eyes, but the warmth in his expression settled somewhere deep inside me, a quiet reassurance that this, whatever this was, might not be a mistake. "Don't get used to it," I muttered, but there was no real weight to my protest. Too late. The airport was a blur of movement, of hurried voices and flashing departure screens. I expected anxiety, the familiar knot of hesitation pressing against my ribs, but it never fully came. Maybe it was the finality of it, the knowledge that the decision had already been made, or maybe it was the way Ethan's hand occasionally brushed against my lower back as he guided me through security, a silent anchor in the chaos. Whatever it was, By the time we boarded the plane, my pulse had steadied, my mind quieting in a way it hadn't in years. The flight was long, hours stretching into a hazy in-between, but when we finally descended, the moment the cabin doors opened, I felt it. The shift. The air was different. Softer, warmer, carrying the scent of salt and something unfamiliar yet soothing. The Pacific breeze wrapped around me as we stepped onto the tarmac, a gentle welcome, a quiet invitation. Ethan carried both our bags without a word, his presence beside me effortless, natural, as if we had done this 100 times before. The drive to the rental was quiet, the coastline stretching endlessly beside us, waves crashing against the cliffs in steady rhythmic bursts. It should have been overwhelming, the change, the reality of what we had done, but instead, there was only a strange, settling calm. That evening, as we stood on the balcony of the small house Ethan had found, the sky painted in streaks of orange and violet, he leaned against the railing, arms crossed, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Think you'll like it here?" His voice was casual, but I knew him too well to miss the way he was watching me, waiting for something, an answer, a reaction, reassurance that this wasn't a mistake. I inhaled deeply, letting the scent of the ocean fill my lungs, letting the quiet settle into my bones. Then, for the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled. "I think I already do." The town was smaller than I expected, nestled between the cliffs and the endless stretch of ocean, a place where time seemed to move differently. The streets were lined with sun-bleached buildings, their facades kissed by salt and age, with small cafes spilling onto cobblestone sidewalks. It felt untouched in a way that Chicago never had, unhurried, deliberate, like it existed for the sake of being rather than for what could be built or achieved within it. The next morning, Ethan was already waiting for me in the kitchen, 2 mugs of coffee on the counter, the scent of roasted beans thick in the air. His hair was still damp from a shower, his t-shirt wrinkled from sleep, and yet he looked at ease in a way I hadn't seen in years. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic of my mug, letting the heat sink into my palms as he leaned against the counter, watching me. "What?" I asked, narrowing my eyes slightly. He smirked, shaking his head. "Nothing. Just, you're actually rested." I wanted to argue, to tell him I was fine, that I had always been fine, but the truth pressed against my ribs. I did feel different. Lighter, somehow, as if I had shed something invisible but heavy. The exhaustion that had followed me for months, maybe years, had loosened its grip, leaving space for something I hadn't yet defined. I took a sip of coffee, savoring the warmth, then nodded toward the door. "Come on. Show me this town you're so confident now, love." The ocean was never far here. Even as we walked through the winding streets, past weathered bookstores and open-air markets, I could hear it, a constant, rhythmic reminder of where we were. Ethan led the way, his steps easy, unhurried, the way they always were when he was somewhere he belonged. And somehow, without even realizing it, I had fallen into step beside him. By midday, we had wandered down to the shore, the waves rolling lazily onto the golden sand, the sun warm against my shoulders. Ethan grinned as he dragged me toward a paddleboard rental, his grip firm around my wrist. "Come on," he said, amusement lacing his voice. "It's easy." It was not easy. The first time I tried to stand, I wobbled violently before toppling straight into the water, salt stinging my lips as I sputtered my way back to the surface. The second time wasn't much better, and by the third, Ethan was laughing so hard he had to crouch to keep from falling over. I glared at him, water dripping from my hair as I clung to the edge of the board. "You're enjoying this too much." He smirked, offering his hand. "Come on, Maddie. I got you." And this time, when I stood, I didn't fall. That evening, we found a cafe perched at the edge of the water, where string lights flickered in the warm dusk air, their glow reflecting off the waves. The sound of quiet laughter and clinking glasses filled the space, a soundtrack of a life that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Ethan sat across from me, a bottle of wine between us, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass absent-mindedly. The light from the setting sun caught in his eyes, turning them softer, warmer. "You're happier here," he murmured, more observation than question. I exhaled, letting my gaze drift toward the horizon, where the sky bled into the sea in a perfect gradient of gold and indigo. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel the weight of expectation pressing down on me. I turned back to Ethan, my chest tightening with something I wasn't ready to name. "Thank you," I said quietly. His lips quirked into a smirk, the kind that had always meant trouble. "Took you long enough to say it." I rolled my eyes, but the smile lingered, and as the sun dipped below the waterline, as the warmth of the evening wrapped around us, I realized something. Maybe this wasn't just a temporary escape. Maybe this was the beginning of something real. The morning air was soft, carrying the scent of salt and citrus through the open window. It drifted lazily into my room, wrapping around me like a whispered invitation to wake slowly, to savor the quiet before the day truly began. I stretched beneath the light linen sheets, feeling the warmth of the sun spill across my skin, and for the first time in years, there was no urgency pulling me from sleep, no emails waiting, no meetings demanding my attention, no weight pressing down on my chest. Just stillness. Then, a soft knock at the door. Before I could answer, it creaked open, and there he was, Ethan, standing in the doorway with a tray balanced in his hands. The scent of fresh coffee and warm toast filled the space between us, and I blinked at him, still caught in the haze of sleep. His hair was slightly mussed, like he had run his fingers through it absent-mindedly, and his t-shirt clung to him in that effortless way that made it seem like he had always belonged here. "Breakfast in bed?" I murmured, sitting up and tucking my knees beneath me as he crossed the room. Ethan smirked, setting the tray down carefully before sinking onto the edge of the bed. "Figured you deserved it." I glanced at the spread. Perfectly scrambled eggs, golden toast, a bowl of fresh fruit. My stomach fluttered with something that had nothing to do with hunger. "What's the catch?" I asked, arching a brow. He leaned back slightly, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze steady. "You staying?" The words settled between us, quiet but unshakable. I swallowed, my fingers tracing the edge of the coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep into my skin. It wasn't an unreasonable request. I had been here for weeks now, long enough to feel the shift in my body and my mind. The exhaustion that had once clung to me like a second skin had loosened its grip. I could breathe easier, laugh without it feeling like an afterthought. The weight I had carried for years had lightened, not completely, but enough to make me wonder why I had let it become my normal for so long. And then there was Ethan. Steady, unwavering, the one constant through every version of my life. He had always been there, even when I didn't ask him to be, even when I tried to convince myself I didn't need anyone at all. And yet, he had never demanded anything in return, never asked for more than I was willing to give. Until now, I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, feeling the quiet certainty in it. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just about my health anymore. Maybe this was about something bigger, something I wasn't ready to lose. I picked up a piece of toast, taking a slow bite before nodding slightly. "Okay," I said softly. Ethan's lips twitched, but he didn't push, didn't demand anything more. He just reached out, brushing a crumb from my cheek with the pad of his thumb, his touch lingering for the briefest moment before pulling away. And that was it. No grand declarations. No dramatic goodbyes to my old life. Just a quiet decision made over coffee and toast in a sunlit room by the ocean. And somehow that was enough.